It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon in 1902, inside the bustling courthouse dining hall of a small Louisiana town. The long wooden tables were crowded with clerks, lawyers, townsfolk, and visitors who had stopped by for a hearty meal after the morning's proceedings. The room echoed with the sound of cutlery clinking against plates, conversations about land disputes and harvests, and laughter that spilled from one corner to the next. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden streaks across polished floors. It was the picture of small-town normalcy, simple, familiar, safe. But within minutes, that ordinary scene unraveled into something grotesque. As cups were raised and bread was broken, a sudden silence fell, broken only by the first scream. One diner clutched his throat, gasping for breath. Another collapsed into his soup, sending the bowl crashing to the floor. Panic erupted as more and more guests staggered, their faces pale, their bodies convulsing. What had been a room of laughter now became a chamber of chaos. Chairs overturned, plates shattered, and voices cried out for help that never arrived in time. By the time order was restored, it was too late. Several diners lay lifeless, their last meal still before them, while others hovered between survival and death. The courthouse, once a symbol of justice and civility, had become the stage for one of the most horrifying mysteries in the town's history. Official reports hurriedly stamped the incident as food poisoning, a tragic accident brought about by spoiled ingredients or poor kitchen practices. It was a simple explanation, neat enough to close the books and calm the panic, but the town refused to be calmed. Whispers crept through the streets like smoke. This was no accident. Some claimed to have smelled a bitter metallic tang in the food, something foreign, something deliberate. Others swore they had seen a shadow slip into the kitchen before the chaos began. And a few whispered of curses, of old rivalries and unresolved grudges that could have turned an ordinary meal into a calculated act of revenge. In the days that followed, the courthouse dining hall was sealed, but its silence only amplified the questions. Who had poisoned the meal? Why target the courthouse, a place meant to uphold order and justice? Was it political vengeance, personal spite, or something darker that defied explanation? It is not just the retelling of a tragedy. It is an opening into a labyrinth of competing truths. On one side stand the official documents, tidy in their rationality, declaring a case closed. On the other stand the voices of the townspeople, unwilling to accept coincidence in a moment that felt deliberate, even malicious. Between them lies the tension that still haunts the story, the clash between fact and folklore, innocence and malice, reason and the supernatural. And so, more than a century later, the courthouse dining hall remains a symbol of unanswered questions. The tragedy of 1902 was more than a meal gone wrong. It was the day time paused, trust shattered, and a town was left wondering whether the real poison lay in the food, or in something far more human. The tragedy of 1902 did not strike faceless strangers. It did not unfold in some distant battlefield or an anonymous alley. It took place in the heart of a courthouse, the very institution meant to protect the lives of ordinary citizens. To understand the weight of what was lost that day, we must step back into the lives of those who filled the dining hall. They were not just names in faded reports or tally marks in a ledger of the dead. They were lawyers and clerks, mothers and fathers, farmers and townsfolk, each carrying their own stories, ambitions, grudges, and secrets. Their lives were threads woven into the fabric of the community, and when poison touched their lips, it tore more than flesh and bone. It ripped at the soul of the town itself. The first to be remembered in official accounts was James Holloway, a respected county lawyer. Holloway was known for his sharp tongue in court and his equally sharp suits, tailored to make him stand out from the humbler men of the parish. In public, he was admired, a man of justice, as the local paper once described him. But within whispers of the town, Holloway's reputation was double-edged. He was rumored to have debts, to have lost money gambling in back rooms after long nights of trial preparation. Some said he had made enemies not only in the courthouse but in the taverns as well. To his wife and children, he was a proud provider. To rivals, he was a man easy to despise. His presence in the dining hall that day would later be a focal point for theories. Was he the intended target, or simply another victim of circumstance? Seated near Holloway was Samuel Crane, the courthouse clerk. Unlike Holloway, Crane lived quietly, his head often bent over documents, his handwriting neat and precise. To most, he was invisible, the kind of man who kept records without fuss, ensuring the machinery of the courthouse ran smoothly. Yet Crane carried a reputation too, an image of loyalty that some believed concealed bitterness. He had been overlooked for promotions, passed over in favor of men like Holloway, and rumors suggested he harbored resentment. His widow later insisted he was incapable of malice, a devoted churchgoer who carried his Bible everywhere. But to others, Crane was a man whose silence could hold more than patience. It could hold grudges. That silence was broken only once, on the day he gasped for breath in the dining hall, clutching his chest before collapsing beside his unfinished plate. The victims were not confined to courthouse staff. Among the fallen was Margaret Lewis, a farmer's wife who had come to town for the rare treat of dining in the courthouse hall, where meals were sometimes served cheaply to travelers and visitors. Margaret's life was one of toil. Her hands hardened from years of tending fields, her back bent from carrying more burdens than her fair share. Her presence that day was unusual, almost fateful. To her neighbors, she was the embodiment of resilience and faith, but there were darker undercurrents. Some recalled how Margaret's farm was entangled in a border dispute that had recently wound its way through the very courthouse where she now dined. Her rivals, a neighboring family, had accused her husband of encroaching on their land. Margaret had defended her family fiercely, even publicly, her sharp words leaving a mark. Was it possible her death was tangled in that dispute, a silent warning cloaked in tragedy? Or was she merely in the wrong place at the worst possible moment? At another table sat Thomas and Eliza Ward, a young couple recently wed. They had come into town for legal documents related to their small inheritance, and the courthouse meal was a chance to celebrate before returning to their modest farmhouse. They were remembered as bright-eyed, hopeful, and deeply in love, the kind of couple whose presence softened even the harshest days of others. Their deaths struck the town hardest, perhaps because they embodied its dreams of continuity and renewal. For years after, neighbors would recall their laughter as they entered the dining hall, a laughter that echoed cruelly against the screams that followed. To some, their deaths were proof of randomness, of innocent joy snuffed out without reason. To others, their youth and optimism made them suspicious. Did they know something they should not have, or carry secrets too heavy for their years? Not all victims were mourned equally. Henry Beaumont, a local businessman, was despised by many. Beaumont had made his fortune lending money at high interest to desperate farmers, often foreclosing on those unable to pay. While some townsfolk respected his acumen, more resented his ruthlessness. Beaumont was said to keep meticulous ledgers of debts owed, guarding them more fiercely than his own health. His sudden death that day sparked as much satisfaction as sorrow among those he had wronged. Some claimed the poison was meant for him alone, and the others were collateral damage. Others whispered that he had poisoned himself accidentally, mixing something dangerous into his drink in a paranoid attempt to test others. In a tragedy where all seemed innocent victims, Beaumont's presence complicated the narrative. Was justice, in some twisted way, finally delivered to him? The dining hall that day was not just filled with the well-to-do and prominent. Several unnamed townsfolk, day laborers and travelers shared the same fate. Their names were recorded in passing, a man of no fixed address, a widow from the outlying parish. Yet their lives were equally valuable, their stories equally lost. These forgotten victims underscored the randomness of the tragedy. Poison does not discriminate, and their anonymity added to the mystery. Were they truly incidental casualties, or was their anonymity itself part of the design? People chosen precisely because their disappearance would raise fewer questions. In recounting these lives, a pattern emerges. A mix of the admired and the despised, the innocent and the questionable, all seated together in one room. Each victim carried not only a plate but a history, histories filled with grudges, debts, rivalries, and whispered secrets. The courthouse had long been a stage for human conflict, a place where truth and deception wrestled daily under the gaze of law. That stage shifted on that afternoon, when the courtroom spilled into the dining hall, and justice gave way to something darker. The families left behind painted pictures of their loved ones as saints, pillars of the community, victims of an unspeakable crime. But neighbors, emboldened by anonymity, shared other portraits of debts unpaid, arguments overheard, affairs suspected, and tempers that flared in the heat of Louisiana summers. In the clash of these narratives, the victims became more than mere casualties. They became characters in a story larger than themselves, each one a possible reason, each one a potential clue. Perhaps that is why the tragedy has never faded from memory. To tell the story of the courthouse poisoning is to tell the story of a town itself, its rivalries, its hypocrisies, its fragile bonds of trust. These were not nameless ghosts, but living, breathing people whose lives reflected the contradictions of the community. Kindness and cruelty, faith and suspicion, innocence and guilt. When poison entered their midst, it did more than still their hearts. It revealed the fractures that had long run beneath the surface. And as the years passed, those fractures deepened. Families of victims clung to memories of love, while skeptics clung to memories of grudges. The courthouse dining hall, once a place of nourishment, became a symbol of unresolved tension. Each life lost added weight to the mystery, and each whispered rumor added fuel to the fire. The victims, then, are not merely background to a larger crime.
They are its core, its emotional anchor.
To understand who they were is to understand why the tragedy continues to haunt us. Because they were like us, ordinary people with extraordinary complexities, sitting down to a meal they believed would end in laughter, not death. And so the memory of James Holloway's sharp wit, Samuel Crane's silent bitterness, Margaret Lewis's resilience, the Ward couple's innocence, Henry Beaumont's ruthless ambition, and the nameless travelers, all of them lingers. They form the beating heart of the story, reminding us that beneath every historical mystery lies a human tragedy, and behind every whisper of poison is the echo of voices silenced too soon. The morning began like any other in the courthouse square. Sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the building, bouncing off the pale walls and stretching across the wooden floors of the dining hall. Outside, wagons rattled by and the clamor of horseshoes striking stone echoed faintly, but inside the air was thick with the sounds of clinking cutlery and the low hum of conversation. Meals were being prepared with a methodical rhythm. Pots clattered, steam rose, and the faint aroma of roasted meats mingled with the sharp scent of onions and vinegar. Nothing in those early hours suggested that the day would soon descend into horror. The dining hall had long been a place of respite, where townsfolk and courthouse officials alike gathered not simply to eat, but to share the warmth of community. Witnesses later recalled the meals with unnerving precision. Bread still warm from the oven, bowls of stew seasoned with herbs, pitchers of water and ale set along the tables. The food looked wholesome, almost inviting. Servants moved briskly between tables, their aprons spotted with flour and sweat. Some swore they noticed one servant's hands trembling as she poured drinks, though at the time it was brushed aside as fatigue. Others claimed the smell of the stew carried something peculiar, an acrid undertone, metallic and faintly sour, unlike anything they had tasted before. To some it was unnoticeable. To others, it was a warning ignored. As the hall filled, voices overlapped. Arguments about court cases, laughter from young clerks gossiping, the gentle murmur of wives discussing household matters. A few men lit cigars, their smoke curling lazily toward the rafters. The Ward couple, newlyweds, leaned close to one another, whispering as though the rest of the room did not exist. James Holloway, the lawyer, spoke loudly of a recent case, his booming voice punctuated with laughter that carried across the room. Samuel Crane sat in silence, his eyes lowered to his plate, listening but never joining in. For a moment, the hall seemed alive with the ordinary pulse of daily life, but ordinary turned swiftly to extraordinary. The first sign came without warning. A clerk at the far end of the room dropped his spoon and gripped the table, his face draining of color. He retched violently, his chair scraping backward as he stumbled to his feet. The sound silenced the room, every head turning. Within moments, two others began coughing, their hands pressed to their stomachs. Eyewitnesses remembered the sudden shift. Laughter replaced by gasps, plates abandoned mid-bite, the growing chorus of chairs dragging against the floor as people staggered. Panic rippled like a wave. Some diners clutched their throats as though their breath had been stolen. Others collapsed outright, their bodies convulsing, striking the wooden boards with hollow thuds that would echo in memory long after. Margaret Lewis was seen gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white before she crumpled forward into her stew. Eliza Ward screamed for her husband as he fell to his knees, his lips foaming, his body shaking in agony. The smell of food seemed to sour instantly, the once inviting aromas curdling into something bitter, suffocating and wrong. Eyewitnesses later spoke of details that remain impossible to verify. Some swore the air grew colder, as though an unseen draft swept through the room. Others said they caught glimpses of movement in the kitchen, shadows slipping between doorways where no cook was supposed to be. A few insisted they smelled iron, sharp and metallic, mingled with the scent of scorched herbs. Rational minds dismissed these recollections as the chaos of panic, but the witnesses clung to them nonetheless, their certainty unwavering even decades later. In the kitchen itself, confusion reigned. Servants scattered, some rushing to fetch water, others frozen in terror. One claimed that a pot had been left unattended, bubbling over with froth that smelled rancid. Another whispered that she had seen a stranger's hand stirring the pot earlier, a figure she did not recognize among the regular staff. These details blurred with fear, leaving investigators later to wonder, were they real observations or desperate attempts to explain the inexplicable? The timeline of collapse was chillingly swift. Within minutes, nearly every table had someone doubled over, writhing or unconscious. The hall that had moments before been filled with cheerful conversation was now a tableau of horror. Bodies slumped over tables, dishes scattered and broken, the floor slick with spilled drink and the traces of vomit. Those who had not yet fallen fled toward the doors, tripping over the fallen, their cries echoing against the high ceiling. Horses outside shied and pulled against their reins at the noise, their panicked neighs adding to the chaos. Doctors were summoned in haste, but even they faltered. Some tried to force water into the mouths of the stricken. Others attempted to induce vomiting, yet nothing seemed to halt the progression. The poison, whatever its source, worked mercilessly, coursing through bodies with a speed and violence that left little time for remedy. Survivors would later speak of the terrible quiet that followed the storm of screams, when the hall was filled only with the labored gasps of the dying and the sobs of the living. Rumors began before the bodies had cooled. Some swore the poisoning was deliberate, targeting certain individuals, perhaps Holloway, perhaps Beaumont, the much-hated businessman. Others insisted it was a curse, punishment for the corruption and sin that had taken root in the courthouse. A preacher, present that day, declared that he heard the clock strike 13 instead of 12, as though time itself had twisted to mark the moment. His words would fuel decades of legend, transforming the tragedy into something larger than crime, something unearthly. What lingers most from that day is not only the loss of life, but the uncertainty. Every detail, whether the smell in the stew, the shadow in the kitchen, the tremor in a servant's hand, becomes both evidence and myth. Fact dissolves into rumor, rumor hardens into folklore, and the truth lies buried somewhere in between. To this day, no one can say with certainty how the poison was introduced, or even whether it was poison alone that struck the diners down. But one fact remains indisputable. In the span of a single meal, the heart of the town was silenced, and the courthouse became a place where justice gave way to horror. The courthouse dining hall, once a place of bustling community life, was now transformed into a morgue. The tables, still set with half-eaten meals, bore silent witness to the chaos that had unfolded. The air reeked of sickness and death, mingled with the acrid tang of spilled stew and stale tobacco smoke. Outside, families gathered, wailing as bodies were carried out, while lawmen pushed through the throngs with grim determination. Within hours of the tragedy, the machinery of investigation was set into motion. But in 1902, Louisiana, science, superstition, and human fallibility were bound tightly together, ensuring that the search for truth would be as murky as the poison itself. The sheriff, James Fletcher, arrived with deputies at his side. A man accustomed to brawls and theft, not mass death, Fletcher struggled to impose order. He directed his men to secure the building, though few dared to touch the bowls and pitchers, fearful of contamination. Witnesses were rounded up and questioned in frantic tones. The first theory was simple: spoiled food. Perhaps the meat had rotted, or the water carried sickness. Yet the rapid collapse of so many diners suggested something deliberate, something far more sinister. The doctors called to the scene noted symptoms: convulsions, foaming at the mouth, violent retching, that aligned less with spoiled food than with chemical poisoning. Still, they lacked the tools to prove it. Samples of the stew and bread were set aside for testing, though what passed for testing in that era was rudimentary at best. A physician boiled a spoonful over flame, claiming the acrid smoke proved the presence of arsenic. Another disagreed, insisting the smell was nothing but onions burned too long. The clash of opinions sowed confusion, and with every hour the certainty of truth slipped further away. Attention turned quickly to the kitchen staff. Servants were interrogated, their voices trembling as they recounted the morning's work. One swore she had seen a stranger enter the kitchen briefly, a man in a dark coat who disappeared before she could raise alarm. Another insisted that a fellow cook had argued heatedly with James Holloway, the lawyer, only a week before. Whispers of grudges, debts, and simmering rivalries began to weave themselves into the narrative, each one pointing to a possible hand behind the crime. Yet the accounts contradicted one another, leaving investigators tangled in rumor. The courthouse clerks provided more fodder. Letters found in the belongings of Samuel Crane hinted at unpaid debts and veiled threats from creditors. A diary belonging to Margaret Lewis, discovered after her death, spoke of a quarrel among townsfolk, though names were omitted. Records of lawsuits revealed bitter feuds between Holloway and several businessmen, each with potential motive for vengeance. But was the poison meant for one man alone, or for all who shared that table? The indiscriminate nature of the deaths suggested the latter, though some insisted the intended victims had merely been caught among the innocent. Superstition crept quickly into the vacuum of fact. A preacher claimed the deaths were divine judgment, punishment for corruption within the courthouse. Townsfolk whispered of curses laid upon the land, recalling old tales of vengeful spirits haunting the square. These stories spread faster than the sheriff's official proclamations, fueling paranoia. For every rational theory, an equal and opposite explanation rooted in fear and folklore arose. Some believed the poisoner was not a person at all, but the embodiment of sin, slipping unseen through the kitchen. Others swore the 13th strike of the clock that day had heralded doom. The sheriff tried to anchor the investigation in reason, but his efforts faltered against both limited science and the hysteria of the people. He compiled lists of suspects: Holloway's rivals, servants with grudges, merchants angry over taxes. Suspicion fell heavily on one cook, a young man named Elias, whose nervous manner and unexplained absence from the hall at the height of the chaos raised eyebrows. Yet no evidence tied him directly to the stew. Another theory implicated a drifter, seen in town that morning, described as wearing a black hat and carrying a satchel. Deputies scoured the roads, but no such man was found. Doctors, too, struggled. Without reliable chemical tests, they relied on smell, taste, and observation, methods prone to error. Some insisted arsenic was to blame. Others suggested strychnine, pointing to the convulsions. But the doses seemed too large, too swift, too coordinated for accident. If it was murder, it had been planned with chilling precision. Modern analysts looking back note how the investigation was doomed from the start. Evidence was poorly preserved, samples mishandled, and records incomplete. The tools of forensics we now take for granted, microscopes, toxicology, fingerprinting, were rudimentary, leaving the truth forever clouded. Suspicion extended beyond individuals to the very structure of the town. Was this tragedy an act of revenge against the courthouse itself, a symbol of authority, law, and power? The dining hall, after all, was filled with not just townsfolk, but the very people who shaped justice in the parish: lawyers, clerks, judges, and officials. To strike them down at once was to cripple the machinery of governance. This theory gained traction among those who saw the poisoning not as personal vendetta, but as rebellion, a blow struck from the shadows. Yet again, no proof surfaced. As weeks passed, frustration mounted. The sheriff issued public statements urging calm, but each new funeral deepened resentment. Families of the dead demanded answers, pointing fingers at rivals and outsiders alike. Rumors of cover-ups spread, that officials shielded certain suspects, that businessmen bribed investigators to look away, that the deaths were not solved because those in power feared their own guilt might be uncovered. Letters and journals from survivors add another layer of mystery. One clerk wrote that he dreamed nightly of a figure in black stirring a pot, though he admitted he could no longer tell if the image came from memory or imagination. Another swore that in the weeks following the poisoning, he heard footsteps in the empty dining hall and smelled the same metallic tang that had preceded the deaths. Were these lingering effects of trauma, or signs that something unearthly clung to the place? Historians studying the case argue that the investigation revealed more about human nature than about the crime itself. Faced with inexplicable tragedy, the town fractured along lines of fear, suspicion, and superstition. Every rivalry became motive, every absence became proof, every rumor became evidence. Yet without the tools to confirm or deny, officials floundered, and the truth was buried beneath layers of conflicting testimony. Modern analysis underscores the tension between reason and horror. Forensic science today might have identified the poison, traced its source, and cleared the innocent. Instead, the limitations of 1902 left the town trapped in uncertainty. Psychology, too, offers explanation. Collective trauma sharpened suspicions, reshaping memory into myth. Folklore flourished where facts failed, and the poisoning became not just an unsolved crime, but a story, part cautionary tale, part ghost legend, that endures to this day. In the end, no one was convicted. No one confessed. The sheriff closed his books reluctantly, writing only that death came swiftly and by design, Yet the hand that delivered it is lost to us. Families carried their grief into silence, and the courthouse stood as both monument to law and reminder of its failure. The suspects faded into obscurity, the servants moved away, and whispers lingered in the shadows of the dining hall. Whether it was accident, malice, or something darker, the investigation left only fragments, letters, rumors, scars, and a question that still chills. Was the poisoner human, or was the true culprit the darkness that dwells in fear itself? ChatGPT said, "The survivors of the courthouse dining hall poisoning carried their scars not on their skin, but in their minds, hearts, and memories. They lived when dozens had not, and that survival came at a cost. From the moment they staggered out of the building, coughing and clutching their stomachs, to the weeks and years that followed, each bore an invisible burden that never lifted. Their testimonies, scattered across journals, newspaper interviews, and whispered confessions, reveal a pattern of lingering trauma. Some recounted visions of colleagues collapsing. Others swore they could still smell the sharp metallic tang of poison long after it had dissipated. What they experienced was more than grief. It was a haunting that blurred the line between psychological memory and supernatural curse. One clerk, Thomas Avery, left a diary that scholars still reference today. In the first days after the tragedy, he wrote about the physical weakness that consumed him. Trembling hands, shallow breath, a gnawing ache in his stomach. But as the weeks passed, his entries shifted from the body to the mind. He described waking in the night to the sound of chairs scraping against a floor, though his house was empty. He swore he heard voices arguing faintly in the distance, words, muffled yet familiar, as though the conversations from the dining hall were replaying in his dreams. By candlelight, he admitted he feared closing his eyes, for every time he did, he saw James Holloway fall forward into his plate, the lawyer's eyes bulging as foam dripped from his mouth. Avery confessed he began to avoid food altogether, believing every bite might be poisoned. Neighbors noticed his gaunt face, his sunken cheeks, and whispered that he was slowly wasting away. Not from arsenic, but from terror. Another survivor, a servant girl named Lila, became the focus of local superstition. She had been the one to carry the stew into the hall, though she herself had eaten none. In her recollections, the smell of the stew lingered in her nostrils for months afterward, no matter how many times she washed her hands or burned herbs to cleanse the air. Lila told her family she saw shadows move in the corners of her room at night. She swore that when she passed by the courthouse, she heard the faint sound of spoons clattering against bowls, as though the meal was still being served. Children taunted her, calling her Death's Waitress. Adults avoided her, muttering that the spirits of the dead clung to her skirts. Unable to endure the scrutiny, Lila left town entirely. Some say she married and changed her name, others that she vanished into the swamps, swallowed by the same darkness that had taken the hall. For others, the haunting was not so much external as internal. Margaret Lewis's sister, one of the few women to survive, described years of nightmares. In them, the dining hall repeated endlessly, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the sudden silence when the first cough broke the harmony. She relived. The moment bodies slumped over the table, the air filled with gasps and cries. The scrape of chairs as people collapsed to the floor. In her nightmares, she too would collapse, waking with a scream that left her drenched in sweat. Her children recalled that she often walked the halls of her home late at night, murmuring to herself, unable to rest. The courthouse itself became a character in these testimonies. Survivors described it as though it were alive, breathing, and vengeful. One man swore that whenever he entered the building for work, he smelled faint traces of the same bitter odor that had filled the hall that day. Another clerk claimed he saw handprints burned into the wood of the dining table, as if the dying had left their mark permanently. Even repairs could not erase the feeling. Workers said their tools went missing, that doors opened on their own, that drafts of cold air passed through sealed rooms. Whether true or imagined, the stories cemented the courthouse as a cursed place. Newspapers seized upon these accounts, amplifying them into legend. Reporters described the courthouse as a building of whispers, a place where survivors shuddered and refused to linger. Articles recounted with relish the testimonies of men who saw apparitions at night and women who fainted when they heard spoons clatter in their kitchens. What began as trauma became folklore, feeding a cycle in which survivors' fears were confirmed and magnified by the very community around them. But not all survivors agreed with the supernatural explanations. Some, like Sheriff Fletcher, insisted the visions and dreams were nothing more than the human mind grappling with grief and horror. He wrote in his notes that, "A man may relive the sight of death in his mind, but that does not mean ghosts walk among us." He attributed the smells to imagination, the sounds to creaking wood and scurrying mice. Yet even Fletcher admitted he preferred to keep the dining hall locked, as though he too felt the weight of its silence pressing down upon him. The debate between trauma and haunting reveals the tension of that era. In 1902 Louisiana, science and superstition lived side by side. While some argued for psychological explanations, others insisted the courthouse had been cursed by sins committed within its walls, sins of greed, corruption, and betrayal. A preacher thundered from his pulpit that the dead could not rest until justice was served. Survivors, already fragile, were caught in the middle, their suffering twisted into symbols for larger battles of faith and fear. Accounts from children of survivors add another layer. Many wrote years later that their parents never spoke openly about the poisoning, yet their silence was louder than words. They described households where laughter was rare, where meals were eaten in strained quiet, where the sight of stew or bread could bring tears. One son recalled how his father refused to sit at the head of the table, saying the place of authority was cursed. Another remembered her mother lighting candles every evening, whispering prayers to ward off spirits. These families inherited the haunting, living in homes where trauma passed like a shadow from one generation to the next. Modern psychology frames these accounts as post-traumatic stress, the mind replaying horrors in an endless loop. Survivors exhibited symptoms we now recognize: nightmares, avoidance, hypervigilance, intrusive memories. But to them, it felt like possession, like something outside themselves had lodged in their souls. The courthouse was not just a building. It was a wound carved into memory, festering each time they walked by. Some survivors found strange ways to cope. One clerk began sketching scenes of the poisoning, filling notebooks with grotesque drawings of faces twisted in pain, bowls cracked in two, shadows looming over tables. When asked why, he replied that drawing kept the visions out of his dreams. Another survivor collected herbs and talismans, convinced that charms could protect her from the lingering presence of death. Others turned to alcohol, drowning their memories at the bottom of a bottle. Few found true peace. By the time a decade had passed, the number of living survivors had dwindled, but their stories continued to circulate. Ghost hunters arrived, convinced the courthouse was a site of paranormal significance. Local folklore wove the poisoning into tales of restless spirits who demanded offerings or vengeance. The line between history and myth blurred completely, so that to this day, no one can say with certainty where trauma ended and haunting began. What is undeniable is that the survivors' voices, fragile and fractured, left behind a legacy of memory. Their accounts invite us to question how human beings process horror. Do we create ghosts to make sense of the senseless, or do ghosts emerge from the gaps in reason? The courthouse dining hall became both crime scene and shrine, a place where the living walked among shadows of the dead. Survivors, whether plagued by nightmares or visions, carried with them the echo of that terrible day, ensuring it would never truly be forgotten. And perhaps that is the greatest haunting of all. Not the footsteps in the hall, nor the clatter of unseen spoons, but the weight of memory itself. For memory, once poisoned, can never be cleansed. It lingers like a bitter taste on the tongue, shaping every bite, every breath, every shadow that passes across the wall. ChatGPT said, "Whispers still drift across Louisiana when the story of the courthouse dining hall is told." More than a century has passed since that meal turned into mass death. Yet the question lingers. Was it deliberate murder? A political strike? An act of revenge? Or simply the most tragic accident in the town's history? Theories sprang up almost immediately after the disaster, each more chilling than the last, each feeding into the folklore that has since clung to the ruined building like ivy to stone. And though scholars, psychologists, and skeptics have dissected every scrap of evidence, the truth remains out of reach, leaving an absence where certainty should be. The most direct theory was political murder. In 1902, Louisiana courthouses were not merely places of law. They were battlegrounds of influence, where rival lawyers, judges, and clerks vied for control over land disputes, elections, and contracts. Some suspected that the meal had been poisoned to silence particular voices. A list of the dead reveals names tied to ongoing trials that promised to shift wealth and power. James Holloway, The attorney whose case threatened to expose corruption in a lucrative railroad deal died with his spoon still in hand. Beside him, two clerks who had prepared damning financial records collapsed before they could testify. Was it coincidence or the careful pruning of political enemies under the guise of tragedy? To those who lived through that era of ruthless competition, coincidence seemed too kind a word. Others leaned toward the theory of personal revenge. Small towns thrive on gossip, and in Louisiana's Courthouse Square, grudges grew quietly like weeds beneath the surface. One rumor claimed that a jilted cook, dismissed from the kitchen weeks earlier, had slipped into the pantry to exact her vengeance. Another suggested a landowner, humiliated in court, had bribed someone to lace the stew with arsenic. These theories gave faces to the crime, transforming tragedy into vendetta. The problem was proof. None ever surfaced. Still, stories of a jealous lover, a betrayed employee, or a vengeful debtor gave the community a way to explain the inexplicable, even if the explanations shifted with every retelling. There were also those who believed it was nothing more than an accident, a tragic mishandling of ingredients. In 1902, kitchens were hardly sanitary by modern standards. Spoiled meat, tainted water, or contaminated herbs could easily kill. Doctors of the time spoke of miasmas and corrupted airs, trying to fit the catastrophe into the limited framework of contemporary science. One physician argued that improperly stored milk, curdling in the Louisiana heat, had fermented into poison. Another insisted that a tin container had leached toxins into the stew. The accident theory offered rational comfort, stripping away malice and replacing it with human error. Yet even this explanation failed to settle hearts, because it seemed to deny the strange details that eyewitnesses swore by: the sudden chill in the room, the bitter metallic smell, the way dogs howled outside before the first spoonful was eaten. It was those details that gave rise to legend. Folklore whispered that the meal had been cursed, not spoiled. Some claimed the food was prepared on the 13th hour, a time believed by locals to blur the boundary between the living and the dead. Others said the courthouse stood on land desecrated by an unmarked grave, and that the spirits beneath the floorboards rose in protest. Ghostly apparitions became part of the lore. Diners seen still seated at the long table, repeating their final moments, or shadows drifting across the windows long after the courthouse had been abandoned. Children dared each other to peer inside, swearing they saw candlelight flicker where no one lived. Farmers muttered that their livestock balked near the site, refusing to graze on the grass that grew in its shadow. Over time, the folklore expanded into a warning passed down through generations. Mothers told children not to accept food from strangers, invoking the courthouse poisoning as a cautionary tale. Elders spoke of the cursed meal, a story designed to teach humility and fear of divine judgment. Some preachers declared the deaths a punishment for corruption, framing the poisoning as a biblical reckoning. In sermons, they reminded their flocks that sin would always be revealed, that no courthouse or official title could protect against God's wrath. In this telling, the tragedy transformed from crime to parable, ensuring that its memory was bound not only to the courthouse, but to the very moral fabric of the town. As decades passed, psychologists tried to explain why the legend endured. They argued that the community needed the supernatural to fill the void left by unanswered questions. Trauma, they said, breeds stories, stories that give order to chaos, that turn meaningless suffering into a pattern, even if the pattern is terrifying. Survivors may have hallucinated smells and visions not because ghosts walked the halls, but because memory itself was poisoned. Fear is contagious, and in 1902, it infected every retelling, ensuring that reason could never fully overcome imagination. Historians added their voices, analyzing letters, court documents, and economic rivalries. Some concluded that the most logical explanation was political assassination, carefully disguised. Others leaned toward accident, noting the absence of any confession or proven suspect. Yet historians admitted their frustration. The case produced more speculation than clarity, more smoke than fire. Skeptics dismissed the supernatural entirely, insisting that hauntings were inventions layered onto the tragedy by a community desperate to avoid staring directly at senseless death. And so every theory holds weight, yet none bears the full burden of truth. If it was political murder, why did no one confess? If personal revenge, why did no culprit flee or face justice? If accident, why the eerie testimonies of strange sounds and smells? And if folklore is to be believed, why do so many who enter the ruins still claim to feel watched? The uncertainty itself becomes the most haunting fact of all. The courthouse stands silent now, overgrown and decayed, but its silence is deceptive. Within that emptiness lies a storm of competing explanations, a chorus of voices that never harmonize. Theories clash, legends grow, skepticism counters faith, but no single thread ties them all. What remains is unease. To tell the story is to open a door that leads not to resolution, but to questions that echo without end. Perhaps that is why the tale endures. The courthouse poisoning is not just history, it is mystery distilled into legend, a story that refuses to settle. Each generation reshapes it, as crime, as curse, as caution. Each listener leaves unsettled, debating what really occurred, haunted not by ghosts, but by uncertainty itself. And in that lingering uncertainty, the courthouse dining hall continues to claim new victims, not with poison, but with doubt. The courthouse dining hall is empty now, its walls cracked, its windows shattered, and its long tables nothing more than rotting wood. Yet if you stand in that space on a quiet evening, the silence feels heavy, too heavy, as if it carries the residue of the screams that once filled it. Dust has replaced the laughter of lawyers, clerks, and townsfolk who gathered there that afternoon in 1902. The meals are long gone, but some swear the smell of bitter herbs lingers, as though the air itself remembers. Official records ended with reports of food contamination and speculation of foul play, but records cannot silence whispers. They cannot erase the visions of survivors who swore they saw more than men falling ill. They saw the room itself turn hostile, as though time, breath, and reason had collapsed. Was it the careful hand of a murderer, using poison as a weapon in a battle for power? Was it the vengeance of someone overlooked and underestimated, striking at the heart of the town's authority? Or was it simply an accident, the cruel trick of spoiled food and poor storage, magnified by fear and rumor into legend? And what of the stranger theories? The voices, the flickering shadows, the chill that settled on the room before the first spoonful was swallowed. Were these mere projections of trauma, or traces of something older, something beyond comprehension? The courthouse poisoning has never found a final answer, because every explanation leaves something unresolved. Crime fails to explain the strangeness. Accident fails to explain the precision of its victims. Folklore fails to hold weight against history, and so the mystery endures, balanced precariously between fact and myth. That is its power. For more than a century, parents have told their children to beware of the dining hall, and travelers have stepped lightly when passing its ruins. Folklorists treat it as a parable, historians as an unsolved crime, psychologists as a case study in collective trauma. But for the people who lived in that small Louisiana town, it was something far simpler and far more terrifying. It was proof that even in the heart of ordinary life, at a table set for community and routine, horror can arrive without warning. In the end, the courthouse dining hall is remembered not only for the bodies it claimed, but for the questions it left behind, questions that no sheriff, doctor, or priest could ever answer. Questions that still echo across time, unsettling anyone who dares to look too closely. What truly happened that day? Who or what was responsible? And perhaps most chilling of all, could it happen again?